Beatles' fabulous fifth member. Now, I'm referring, of course, to producer, arranger, and orchestrator George Martin. Now, I was really young as each of the new Beatles LPs came out, and coincidentally, just as I was starting to read, the covers of American Beatles releases started to include a credit for producer George Martin. First time I remember seeing produced by George Martin was on Rubber Soul. And I wondered, what's a producer? I didn't know, but seeing that credit made me curious. And little did I know that recording and music production would become a direction for my whole career. Now, I imagine lots of people hearing Beatles records back then thought about how the sounds were being created and recorded and how classical elements would magically show up and elevate the Beatles' music into something more than typical pop records. And looking back, it's obvious that never before or since has the synergy between a band and producer been so evident or important. Now, there are detractors out there, people who say the Beatles were too highbrow, too classically influenced, too experimental, and those folks seem to lament that the Beatles' original rock and roll and rhythm and blues spirit, their kind of punkiness in the early days, eventually got covered up in layers of more sophisticated musical elements. Okay, Sir George Martin. People think of him as a straight arrow, very proper, maybe even a little stuffy, but he had a very humble upbringing. His father Henry was a carpenter. His mother Bertha had to cook their meals at a communal stove in their apartment building. At age 8, George took 6 piano lessons, but then stopped and kept teaching himself. He actually taught himself music theory, and he wrote his first piano piece at age 8. Didn't hurt that he also had natural perfect pitch. Well, then for quite a while he strayed from music. He worked as a surveyor, he worked as a clerk in the War Office, and he served in the Royal Navy for 4 years. But ultimately that was a good thing because he used a veteran's grant to attend the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. His main instrument was piano, his second instrument was oboe, and he studied composition and orchestration. Important. Now, when he graduated, he worked for the BBC's classical music department. In 1950, he started working at EMI Records and managed their classical catalog, and he became co-founder of the London Baroque Society. 1955, Martin took over the small and struggling Parlophone label for EMI, and he actually managed to start racking up some hits, producing classical, original cast recordings, some jazz, but most notably, comedy records featuring folks like Peter Ustinov, Peter Sellers, and Dudley Moore. He produced every song, even the early ones, from what I'd call an orchestral perspective. So with an orchestra, you're working with a wide variety of instruments in sections. You've got strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion, right? And each section has a certain texture or a timbre, a sonic character to it. You got strings, which are generally mellow and lush. You've got woodwinds, which are pastoral and organic, brass, brilliant and inspiring. You got percussion, which is rhythmic and propulsive. Now, what does the orchestra have to do with the early Beatles? Well, it's really about how sounds on a recording are arranged and layered. When you listen to any early Beatles song, it's notable how balanced all the elements are. I think George Martin and the recording engineers at EMI did a stellar job of recording the band in such a way that the full frequency range is exploited, right? You got Paul's bass down low, and it's full for that time. The guitars have presence and energy, but somehow they don't get in the way of the vocals. And Ringo's drums are propulsive, even aggressive, but they don't get in the way either. And that is no mean feat, especially because they were mixing everything down to a single mono master. Now, George Martin often coached the Beatles on their arrangements, and he encouraged them to add instrumental hooks to keep things interesting at every moment in a song. So nearly every Beatles song has either a memorable musical intro riff to kick it off, or it launches directly into a verse or chorus. It's those hooks that let us identify Beatles songs in the first few beats or notes of an intro. It's brilliant arranging. In 1965, George Martin started introducing actual orchestral instruments into Beatles songs, and he used them in ways that had never been done in pop music. On Yesterday, it's not really the Beatles at all. It's Paul solo with his acoustic guitar and a string quartet. So some of my earliest conscious memories of orchestral instruments come from Beatles songs. And I always thought, wow, those instruments sound so cool. You know, in fact, George Martin's work with the Beatles is the key reason I started playing double bass in 7th grade. He made orchestra and orchestral instruments cool. And he proved over and over in his Beatles arrangements that orchestral instruments could even rock. I mean, most non-musicians don't really think about Eleanor Rigby, right? It's not the Beatles playing instruments. It's just Paul and a double string quartet with John and George adding harmony vocals on the choruses. I mean, that was a radical approach to a rock song back then. George Martin says those stabbing strings were inspired by Bernard Herrmann's score to the movie Psycho. I mean, what's more rock and roll than that? Now, my personal favorite George Martin orchestra arrangement is I Am the Walrus. The orchestra introduces the song and plays through the whole thing. And if you listen to it alone, it's a masterpiece of strange, dark, and beautiful parts. And it's all I can do to resist playing the whole thing for you right now, but here's a chunk.